Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I was hired by the U.S. Navy to investigate a strange wreck in the North Sea. In 2023, I was a PhD student in biology and attended an ESA conference, mostly presenting some astrobiology-related research results, nothing fancy or controversial. During a networking event, a U.S. Navy officer who was attending the conference struck up a conversation with me. He seemed particularly interested in my research background and, after some small talk, casually suggested I apply for a military-sponsored research project. He said they needed biologists for a study in the North Sea. I had no GF, no pets, no immediate career plans, and the pay was good. So I applied. The selection process was a bit hysterical. Security clearances, background checks, even questions about an old high school friend I hadn't talked to in years. I learned that he is living in China. By that point, I knew this wasn't a regular project, but still, I had nothing to hide, so I went along with it. After a few months, I was flown to Germany, where I met the rest of the team. They were mostly young, promising, but not yet established in their respectable fields. People who could disappear for months without raising too many questions. From there, we were taken by boat to an oil rig somewhere in the North Sea. Our phones were confiscated on the way there, but we were warned about that in advance, so no biggie. The research base was either purpose-built for the project or was an oil rig refitted for it, but from the outside it looked like a regular drilling station, probably to avoid scrutiny. Around 30 people were there, engineers, biologists, linguists, and military personnel overseeing the whole thing. We could send and receive emails to family, but they were reviewed by Navy personnel, no attachments allowed. Otherwise, no internet access, no calls home, etc. They told us that a private oil company had discovered a strange structure on the seabed. At first they thought it was a World War submarine wreck, but sonar imaging ruled that out. What they found instead was an elongated spike-like object, about 50 meters long, broken in half, embedded in a crater as if it had impacted at high speed. When I arrived, the engineers were debating how to bring it to the surface. Inflatable flotation devices were considered, but the risk of breaking the object was too high. Instead, they deployed remote-controlled robots that could take pictures and retrieve samples. The depth made human diving impractical, especially since most of us weren't trained for it. The exterior of the object was encrusted with barnacles, seaweed, sediment, and so on. Cleaning it took 2 more weeks. The outer layer was a carbon composite that was brittle, shattering like glass when dropped, but at the same time, it was almost impossible to bend or melt. We didn't receive exact results on dating while I was still there, but based on how overgrown it was, it must have spent centuries at the seafloor at least. For the first month, only the engineers had anything to do. Then, 5 weeks in, they found a sealed, pressurized compartment. The engineers built an external pressurized seal to access the chamber. Inside, we found what was unmistakably a control room. No oxygen, dust-covered consoles, broken panels, and 3 bodies. The first 2 were small, about 1 meter tall, humanoid but weird. Their heads looked oversized for their bodies, but probably would be normal-sized on a regular human. Hairless, no ears or noses, though there were signs these had been removed surgically. They were also castrated. Their eyes were covered by black lenses, implanted directly into the sockets, a bit like built-in sunglasses. At first we thought they were naked, but eventually we figured out they were wearing skin-tight suits that had until now decayed to dust. X-rays and ultrasound scans showed their bodies were riddled with metallic implants, like tiny shards of metal. We thought they were shrapnel from the crash, but they were distributed too deliberately to be accidental. The bodies were still connected to their seats by cables plugged directly into the backs of their skulls. The third body was different. It was tall, over 2 meters, with more human proportions, with long white hair. It was probably just bleached from the passage of time, though, and it was female. No surgical mutilations. She had implants too, but fewer, and in different areas. She also had an artificial kidney. Her suit, unlike the others, was mostly intact. Underneath it, we found plenty of tattoos. They resembled handwriting but didn't match any inscriptions we found, so it probably meant something else. The cause of death was obvious. All of them were killed by the impact, with the female's head nearly detaching from her neck. The linguist attempted to analyze the symbols on the control panels, but they were too faded to read. One metal plate above the consoles had a short inscription etched in it, so it didn't fade. The script consisted of vertical lines with dots and triangles written on them at different heights, a bit like musical notes, but the sample size was too small to translate, so linguists mostly ended up being useless for the whole stay. We tried to take DNA samples, but we got no results, which is unsurprising considering the age and conditions in which these bodies were kept. By the end of the 4 months, we had submitted our reports. We didn't make any more significant findings, and we couldn't recover anything useful using remote subs we were using. Some people, including myself, wanted to continue, but the Navy didn't want to talk about it. I suspect they have since recovered the wreck and moved it stateside. During my stay there, one of the Navy liaisons told me they didn't care if we talk about what we saw there. No one would believe us without a proof, and the government's own disinformation psyops would bury the truth in noise anyways. I haven't told anybody about this, but I'm not worried about getting disappeared. I'm just sad I'll probably never get any answers or credit. Recently I realized that since I wasn't allowed to take any notes with me, I should write it all down before I start to forget. Feel free to ask questions. I'll try to answer. Just keep in mind I was only a junior researcher there.
Draw the craft.
PIC related, just a quick sketch based off my memory. The actual wreck was not visible on cameras due to the buildup of sediment, but it stood out clearly on the sonar. Its rear end was covered by a sand dune. Red rectangle is where we found the pressurized chamber. You could also clearly see remains of the crater it made during its crash.
Some questions. Was the lady alien hot? You're a biologist, so give us the biological details of your report. Give us something that proves you're not full of shit.
The bodies were all so shriveled up that you wouldn't be able to tell. None of us was able to descend to the wreck in person, so best you could do is a 1 centimeter long piece of bone sample. There isn't much to tell, sadly. My expertise is extremophilic invertebrates, which is why I have any interest in space-related topics in the first place, so I didn't have much to say about those humanoid bodies. I checked the samples we collected from mites and such and found nothing, but that's hardly surprising. My biggest contribution was assisting in lab work and being the first to notice that the small corpses were mutilated, instead of just having fallen apart after death. We weren't able to recover any viable DNA samples, but again, this can be chalked up to age and conditions. As far as my general knowledge of human anatomy goes, all 3 bodies were remarkably human, aside from weird proportions.
Care to elaborate the bleaching? My understanding is such a thing wouldn't happen without UV being present.
There are many ways in which hair can change color, including oxidation or natural breakup of pigment over time. In our case, there was no oxygen at the time we discovered the chamber, but I can't say how conditions inside have changed over time. I mostly added that to preemptively react to replies about Nordics.
Thanks for the answer. I discounted oxidation, well due to the lack of oxygen. Are you aware of what the atmosphere inside did contain? If you can remember, what did the engraving look like?
I don't remember the exact inscription, but the symbols looked something like this. There were never more than 3 objects on a single line. The overhead engraving consisted of about 40 to 50 signs. Most other labels were much shorter, more like single word versus sentence. As for the conditions, it was pretty cold, approximately 3 degrees Celsius, with atmosphere consisting overwhelmingly of nitrogen with some other gases including carbon monoxide. O2 was negligible. Since the bodies were so human-like, I don't think they could survive in such conditions. Most likely they were the result of malfunction of life support systems during the crash, maybe some leak, etc. The temperature was likely just result of the depth at which the object rested, as it was pretty close to the surrounding water. No notable radiation. We also did microbiology tests to see if there are any weird bacteria floating in there, but nothing unusual came up.
Wasn't there something similar on the supposed Roswell control panels? Also, did the craft look at all like PIC related?
Hard to tell. I've only ever saw sonar images and blurry underwater camera footage. I think it was more rounded. It was naturally much larger. Care to explain this picture? In our case, it's also not impossible that the craft could have had wings or some other protruding structures that have been destroyed. There was plenty of debris in the surrounding seafloor.
Could the weird proportions be explained by gas under pressure?
By weird proportions, I meant the female being huge and the two smaller bodies having atrophied bodies in relation to their heads. This was definitely an anatomical feature as it could be observed in bones. I should also note that while impossible to say for certain, all bodies had broken bones that would suggest lethal injuries during the crash, so their deaths were most likely due to that, and not change in pressure and atmosphere.
Did the aliens have implants in their chests, PIC-related?
They had implants throughout their whole bodies, but they were nowhere near as big and obvious. As already stated, initially we mistook them for metal debris from the crash which got embedded inside the corpses. Most were no bigger than 3 centimeters and looked like metal shards. The biggest implant was inside the female body. We didn't take it out, but its shape and placement led us to believe it was an artificial kidney. The skeletons looked nothing like the Peruvian mummies. They were obviously human-like with the proper number of ribs, vertebrae, identical limb anatomy, etc.
Why mutilated? From the crash? What was the estimated age and cache time even if you couldn't get dating from samples, etc.?
No. Both of the smaller bodies have had their noses and ears removed. This happened long before their deaths and the crash, as you could observe scars and marks left by stitching. Considering their closeness to human anatomy, this likely didn't affect their functioning much and was done for cultural reasons. They were also both castrated. We were unable to tell their sex from the bodies alone. As for the age, there were different numbers thrown around. Most convincing was one marine biologist who claimed that judging by the buildup of sediment and organisms growing around the wreck, it must be at least 500 years old. No idea how close or far off he was, considering many unknowns.
Were there microorganisms on board on the craft? Is the ship still there on the bottom of the sea? Did the ship have a control panel?
We ran some bacterial cultures using samples from the pressurized chamber. Nothing worth mentioning. Hard to tell if what we found was natively there or if it was the result of contamination during our excavation. No killer or unusual bacteria as far as I know. The wreck might still be there, but my bet is that it was already removed by the Navy. If I were to bet, they wanted us to just confirm that it was dead and not dangerous before moving it to the US. There were plenty of control panels. Each body was seated behind one. All were busted, so all I saw were some buttons and most likely dead screens. 2 smaller bodies were plugged into the panels directly.
I know it probably seems silly, but this scene single-handedly gave me my fear of the water. I watched it on TV when I was pretty young, so it did creep me out. This scene was the first time I thought about being blissfully ignorant to something coming after you under the water, just the stark black and white. I've never gotten the image out of my head when I'm in the water. I remember the first time I became afraid of the water. Uncle has a beautiful cabin on a pond in Maine. Visit every summer, have a great time. Go tubing on the boat, love swimming freely in the deep water. Uncle gets a kick out of trying to knock me out of the tube. Tube goes over the wave and tosses me out. Wait for the boat to circle back to me. Suddenly think of that image something slowly coming after me, and being helpless, floating while the boat takes its time. Start to panic. He's taking forever. Start screaming. Finally comes over. I pull myself to the boat with the rope attached to the tube instead of waiting for it to get closer. Claw myself up to the deck and start sobbing, and I couldn't explain what happened. Ever since, the water has made me a huge baby. Maybe if I never saw that movie, I could still happily swim.
Be 11 years old, living in Kauai, Hawaii at the time, moving around from beach to beach for a few months with my mom and sisters. Go to a beach on the east shore called Polihale. No one but my family around. I decided to swim in the water by myself. Get out maybe 50 feet from shore. Keep going. Pretty much open water, deep and dark. Start thinking about what might be under me. Start thinking about looking down and seeing a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth rising out of the darkness toward me. I'm even shaking trying to type this out, and it's making me nauseous, paralyzed with fear. Good thing the water is calm, or I would have definitely drowned. Start swimming slowly towards the beach, see my family. Start bargaining, as long as I make it back to the beach. Almost crying at this point. Make it to shore, never swim at that beach again. I learned later on from the locals that there were tiger sharks and great whites sighted there not too long before I was there.
I have a similar story. I try not to think about it because it was the closest I have ever come to dying. Be visiting North Carolina coast with my family when I was 13. Get a beach house right across the street from the ocean. It rained pretty much all weekend, so we didn't get out to the ocean much. Swam in the pool the entire time. The day before our last day there, it was raining really hard, and the ocean was kicking up giant waves. I was a pretty tall kid, and they were almost up to my hair. Brother, Dad, and I decided to go chill on the sand and check out the waves. Ocean is churning and violent. The wind was blowing so hard it was difficult to walk against it. Everything seems just gray. I don't really know how to explain it, but the horizon and ocean just seem to be darker and discolored. Dad goes over the dunes to take a piss. Brother and I decide to do something stupid. Stand on the surf and let giant waves knock us over a couple times. It was pretty fun, but this big-ass wave came right as Dad was coming back. Bro backs off. I take it head on. Bad idea, I fall on my ass and the current starts pulling me. It's ungodly strong. I can't even stand. Every time I try, my legs get knocked out from under me, clawing and fighting to stay afloat and not get sucked out. So stricken with fear, I can't even yell for help. All of the sudden, I get ripped out of the water and dragged back to shore. My dad ran out and grabbed me. It's worth noting my dad is 6'8", used to bodybuild and was a Green Beret, and even he could barely stand in this fucking current. Was fucking pissed, cussed me out, and we left early the next morning. I'm 21 now, and I still get bothered thinking about it. It was honestly horrifying. Still thinking I could have been sucked out to sea in the middle of a major storm and never would have been found. What scares me even more was that my bro and I thought about sneaking out and going down there without telling anyone.
I'm a professional diver, anon. I posted a story of mine a couple weeks ago or so. Not going to write it up again, but to give the gist of it. I was doing body recovery on contract for the police, found a body, and attached a line and started swimming to the surface when something grabbed the body and started dragging it at incredible speed. I cut the line just in time to prevent myself from being yanked down with it. I'm sure some of you deep-sea loving anons will remember it. I've got a couple other stories of my own that I can go into more depth if you guys want. Mostly stuff involving fish that were a bit too big for comfort coming to take a look while I was doing some welding. Or that time my rebreather malfunctioned and I started having a full-blown drug trip while I was 200 meters underwater. Fun stuff. I've got a ton of more interesting stories though. Mostly from other divers. I can't speak to the truth of them because I wasn't there. Some are pretty out there. Keep in mind, some of these stories are sort of like diver urban legends. They get passed around until nobody can remember where they got started. The story I'm about to tell you though, I heard from a good friend of mine, a dive master, and the guy who trained me on my first dives. I have no reason to believe he's lying. This was back sometime in the late 80s, I believe. My friend, let's call him Frank, had just gotten out of the Navy and started doing civilian work, mostly welding, and he worked with the police for a short time like I did. Like me, for Frank, diving was both a hobby and a job. So he would spend his weekends exploring known shipwrecks and points of interest known to the local diving community. Sometimes he would just set anchor in a random spot and dive down to see what he could find. He usually found a whole lot of nothing, but on this particular occasion, he hit the jackpot. Metaphorically speaking, because there was nothing good about what he found. He was doing an extreme depth dive that day, which, as I explained in my last post, I'm not going to name the lake he was diving in just in case it somehow leads back to him, but it was a very large lake that was 900 plus feet deep. So he was pushing the boundaries a bit, especially since he was solo diving without any partners. He gets to the bottom, and as per usual, there's just the usual sand, silt, and some rocks covered with algae. Not even any fish that he could see. He digs around in the sand a bit to see if he can find anything, and he feels something hard and smooth buried a few inches under the surface. Frank grabs it and tries to take a look at it a bit further up away from the floating sand. It was some sort of prescription bottle with the label torn off. So he puts it off to the side and keeps digging and finds something much bigger right away. He pulls it out of the sand, and to his shock, he's staring at a human skull. He digs around in the sand some more to find the bones, pretty much feeling his way around because the fine sediments he was digging up made his visibility zero. He found something else hard and pulled it out, but it wasn't another bone. It was another skull. He kept digging and found, on his estimate, at least 200, likely more, skeletal remains at the bottom. Mixed in with the skeletons were, he estimated, thousands upon thousands of prescription bottles like the one he found earlier. He didn't have enough oxygen and time to stay down for long, so he dug around in a few spots to see how large the dump of bodies and bottles was. He estimated it must have been almost 50 by 50 feet roughly in size. So it's possible that there could have been many, many more bodies there than his estimate. Probably the spookiest bit is, since he had done work with the police, he knew what a body looks like underwater at various stages of decomposition. The bones had been picked clean by the fish, but the bones themselves couldn't have been there for much longer than 5 years. Like a good citizen, Frank carried one of the skull pieces up with him to the surface. He talked to some of the people he'd worked in the police with as a diver, and they immediately told him that they were not going to investigate and that he should never speak about it again. Being someone who valued his own skin, Frank did just that, and ended up moving to the other side of the country about a year later. He never told me why, but I've got the feeling that he no longer felt safe working and living there. Okay, time for one of my own shorter stories. Frank has more interesting stories than me, but I want to share some stuff from my own personal experiences as well. This actually happened just last year. I was doing some maintenance repair work on a dam for an artificial lake. I had chosen this spot to work in particular because it was a treasure trove for exploration as a diver. Since the lake was artificial, there were several small villages, farms, and homes that had been submerged when it was constructed, something that's actually surprisingly common when it comes to artificial lakes. So I was down at the bottom of the dam, doing a visual inspection of the gate guides and seal plates, trying to find anything that needed maintenance or replacement. It was summer, so the water was pretty murky and visibility was low. Something nudged me on the back, and I turned around, expecting to see my dive partner, but instead I was starting right at the face of the biggest, ugliest catfish I've ever seen. Water does weird things to your perception of size, but I could swear this thing must have been the size of a small SUV. If it had wanted to, it could have eaten me no problem. I froze in place because I hadn't expected to be in danger from the aquatic wildlife on a freshwater dive, but he swam away and circled around for a while as I worked. It's actually fairly common, fish watching you while you work, but I've never seen one as big as this before. I'm just glad he wasn't hungry. This next story is a bit out there, so to speak. I trust Frank, but being deep underwater can do strange things to the human mind. Narcosis can and does cause hallucinations among other mental disruptions. I've experienced it myself firsthand. When it's happening, your brain can't distinguish reality from the hallucination. And there's never a point in your mind where you go, "Oh wow, I'm tripping," because it's usually a case of the frog boiling where it comes on you slowly. Anyway, back to the story. This was probably the late 90s to early 2000s. Frank wasn't really clear on the date when he told me the story. Frank at this point has graduated from casual wreck exploration to full-blown treasure hunting. He's got a boat with sonar designed to find shipwrecks and all sorts of neat stuff. To this day, he hasn't found anything of actual value, but I suppose the thrill of the chase is a treasure of its own. It was the long weekend, so Frank was making a big expedition to a remote part of the coastline where an old ship apparently sunk in the early colonial period. Nobody ever found the wreck. Their route was known, but there was a storm, and they never arrived. The location was extremely remote. You either got there by boat, almost a 2-day trip from the nearest suitable launch, or you hiked there on foot. Frank figured that the remoteness of the area accounted for the wreck never being found, which is why he was so keen to search himself. He still talks to me about going back there today since he now has a portable sonar system that you can mount on a canoe. He didn't have one of those back then, so he just packed a bunch of food and supplies for the weekend along with his diving gear. I doubt you could even carry a canoe with you on that hike. But if anyone could, it would be Frank. He gets to the ocean, sets up camp a ways away from the ocean in a sheltered nook, then drags his gear down the ocean and goes for a dive. First day, he just snorkeled mostly. Second day, after he had the lay of the land, his words, not mine, Frank decided to go diving. He only had 2 cylinders of air with him from the hike, so he had to make his time count if he wanted to find anything. The entire expedition was ill-advised in my opinion, but Frank does what Frank wants. Apparently, he thought he knew exactly where that damn wreck was, because he had figured out where the currents would be pulling any debris. So he sets out for that spot, swims in and dives. Frank gets to the bottom and, to his disappointment, does not find a shipwreck or sunken treasure or anything really of interest. There's a lot of just various debris and shit, some pop cans, trash, and garbage even. Just when he's about to give up, he hears the telltale sound of a boat motor coming from the surface. His immediate instinct is to surface and say hi, but his instincts were screaming something else. So he decided to wait and see until he ran out of oxygen and had to surface. He swims up a bit closer to the surface to see if he can find the boat, following the sound. He sees come in above him and cut off the engines. Something big gets tossed into the water and begins to sink like a rock. Frank said that it was immediately obvious to him what it was based on the silhouette, but he didn't really fully realize until the man sank past him, eyes bulging with shock, screaming with empty lungs. Frank followed him to the bottom as fast as he could. When he got there, the guy was still conscious, but just barely. He pulled off his rebreather and fitted over the guy's face while trying to free his legs. His legs had been put in buckets full cement. Frank alternated breaths on the rebreather for about 15 minutes while desperately trying to break the guy's feet out of the concrete, without any luck. The whole time he thought the guy was trying to talk to him, trying to say something that he couldn't understand. After about 15 minutes, Frank realized that he couldn't get his legs free. If he stayed down any longer, he would run out of air and die himself. He said leaving the guy down there to drown was the hardest damn thing he ever did. The poor bastard realized Frank was leaving and frantically grabbed him, trying to rip off his rebreather and keep it for himself. Frank ended up kicking him in the face and swimming off without looking back. He reported it to the police, and they found the body about a week later. It was a mob-related killing. Apparently, it actually happens more often than you think. I don't think Frank ever got over what happened the way he described it. First, the pure relief and joy when Frank gave him rebreather, and the agonized, panicked fear when he realized Frank was leaving him. Being someone who dives for a living, I've had lots of friends who drowned on the job for various reasons. It's not something you really dwell on a lot, but this man has always stuck with me. What the hell was he thinking in his final moments? It's probably due to my line of work, but I've got a bit of a fascination with death. Or rather, the final thoughts right before death. That last final spark before everything gets snuffed out forever. I have more stories to tell you, anons, but I've got to go do real-life shit now. So if this thread is still here later, I'll come and post some more. If not, I'll post them in the next deep sea thread that I come across. Thanks for all the kind words.
My family was in the Keys for vacation when I was probably 11 or 12. We had rented a boat and gone out to this lighthouse that was surrounded by a beautiful reef. So we went snorkeling near the boat. A lot of other people were out there, but all the boats were pretty spread out. I wasn't afraid of that water because I lived in Florida. The water was clear and only 15 to 20 feet deep. While the rest of us were in the water, looking at the fish, my dad spotted a small shark. It was small, but almost as big as I was at the time. I was in the water on the other side of the boat from the ladder and the motor when my dad decided to start throwing chum at and around us, his way of breaching the topic of there being a shark nearby. My mum and sister freak out and start splashing and fighting to get up the ladder. Meanwhile, I'm fucking having a heart attack as I swim as fast as I can around the dark water under the boat, to the side with the ladder. I was freaking out and shouting at my dad, but I could have sworn I saw that shark right underneath that pontoon piece of shit we rented as I reached the ladder. By the time I was on the boat, it was swimming around. and we got to see all the other sharks that were nearby. Probably 5 of them, total. I hate my father, and I hate the ocean.
Merchant Marine here. Weird shit happens, but we're usually tired and corporate doesn't like us blaming ghosts, so we usually find a logical explanation. That said, I'm always careful crossing the 40th parallel. Last time we did the boiler igniter tip shit itself, and she wouldn't fire right for 2 days until the first figured it out in the shower. I've seen some stuff move around on one of the steamboats I worked on, but again I was tired, and working 12-hour watch shifts. That said, I'm going out to sea again soon on a much larger vessel, so if weird shit happens, I'll definitely post about it here. I'll try to think of other stuff, but mostly it's stories I've heard from other folks. We had a chief engineer pass away, and a couple weeks later some of the night shift guys heard and saw him on the lower levels a couple of times. That's never happened to me with a specific person, but the chief that gave me my first job did pass recently, so I'm a bit curious. Didn't know him that well, though. When I was a cadet, we did try to use a Ouija board on a ship with several rumored deaths. Navy sailors crushed by machinery, where we did the board, and allegedly another cadet hung himself in an escape trunk. But unfortunately, the retard I was using the board with didn't take it seriously and kept fucking around. I did take a couple of pictures on that ship that were pretty aesthetic, though. Also some gas mask reviews, but those aren't on YouTube anymore. Pick-related? Rubik's Cube I found in the bilge once.
Alright guys, I got a story. Be me. Love Rocean. Go on vacation. I am 16 or so at the time. Cruise, fuck yeah. Go to Mexico. Cozumel, get to port. Dad and I went on a fishing trip there. Deep sea fishing. On the fishing boat, as you would know if you have ever been deep sea fishing, has 2 long arms extending about 2 or 3 meters from the sides of the boat. Arms are to lure fish near. They have long fishing wire and bait attached. Reel in a swordfish, or was it a marlin? I don't know anyways. Big ass fish. Dad catches tiny ass fish. Feeling badass.jpg. The boat starts moving, the engine is off, deckhands screaming at each other in Spanish. They turn on the engine, starts trying to sail in the opposite direction of pull. The boat starts to sink a little. Ease up on the engine, let it pull us, try the engine a few more times. One of the giant steel arms on the boat is ripped clean off. Giant fucking splash. Reel up the other line. Get the fuck out of there. I'm just in the corner smiling at the giant fish I caught. Didn't think about it until after how huge and powerful that fish could have been. Strong enough to rip the steel arm off the boat. Deep down, under the water, hidden from view. Strong enough to pull the boat against the engine. Scary to think about, but I would 10 out of 10 do it again.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.